So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest Knowledge Miles 695th Lord Mayor's lecture. I'm Mark Huxley, and I'm going to be navigating us through today's topic, which is the city resilient against the global terror threat. So I'll give you a quick rundown how the session is going to work. I shall save a proper introduction to Ian for a moment, and he's then going to talk to us for about 20 minutes, which should give us lots of times for Q&A. To ask a Q&A, there's a button on the top right hand side of your screen, which is a call out box with a question mark. Please put your questions in there. Don't put them in the chat, and please don't try and put a hand up to ask a question, because we just won't see them and they'll get missed, which will be a great shame. We'll try and get through as many of your questions as we can, but all of the questions are captured along with your details, and they'll be shared with Ian at the end of the session so he can follow up. And the session's being recorded, which I think you'll know, and there's a dedicated YouTube channel. So in a day or so, it'll appear on there for you to go back, look again, and share with other friends and family. So on to Ian. So welcome, Ian. Thank you for joining us. So a quick run through of Ian and his career. So Ian retired in 2022 from a 38-year career in policing, the last 6 as the Commissioner of the City of London Police. In that role, he was National Police Lead for Fraud, Economic Crime, Cybercrime, Financial Investigation and Business Crime. Also, the National Police Lead on Tech and Information Management for 6 years, and the National Police Senior Information Risk Owner, CIRO. Enjoying what is clearly an active retirement, is now trustee on a number of charities, NEDs, and advises to another companies in crime, tech, cyber security sectors, and very proudly awarded the Queen's Police Medal in 2016, Distinguished Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, and in 2022 became a Deputy Lieutenant for Greater London. And as if that's not enough, and thank you for the sponsor of today's lecture, he's active in the Worshipful company of security professionals, and as part of his lecture, he's going to give us a little introduction to them and tell us about the great things they do. So I'm gonna shut up now, Ian, and pass over to you. So I will see you again in about 20 minutes for the Q&A.
Mark, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear and see okay online. As Mark said, I think you got a little bit of my background. What I plan to do in the 20 minutes I've got is to just give you a little bit of an overview of the city and the City of London Police from a sort of CT perspective. Some of you, if not all of you, will know some of the information I'm going to give you, but hopefully it gives you a bit of context to what I'm going to talk about in the main. I'm then going to sort of talk about the history and development of policing, CT and CT policing in the City of London, probably over the last 30, 40 years, so you can see how it's developed and how it's changed. Then talk about some of the changes that the police have adopted in meeting what is a very changing threat, and the important role of partnership in that response. And then just a little bit about the security professionals, of which I'm proud to be a member, and a little bit about the work that they do. So if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just to give you some context to why the city is important from a counterterrorism perspective. You'll see there some of the statistics. I'm not going to go through all of them. The days of the city sort of closing down at 6 o'clock in the evening have long gone, as I'm sure many of you know. 700 licensed premises, huge crowded spaces. I'm told that the McDonald's at Liverpool Street Station is the second biggest or second busiest McDonald's in the country, after somewhere in Birmingham, centre of Birmingham. So it's crowded spaces. There's iconic sites, you know them as well as I do, St Paul's, London Bridge, some of the city landmarks, the Old Bailey. It's a target-rich environment, and that's why the city has had a focus on counterterrorism for a number of years. Next slide, please. So the City of London Police, again, not known by everyone, but known by many of you, I'm sure, a proudly independent police force, separate from the Metropolitan Police, created in 1839 by a separate act. Currently, it's got about 1,000 officers and 300 staff supporting those officers. It has national police responsibilities for those items you see there: fraud, economic crime, cybercrime, financial investigations, and business crime. It's a big part of the business. Probably about a third of the resources of the city are devoted to those national responsibilities, and that's really important because it sort of roots the city in national policing, and in fact global policing around those areas. It also has the day-to-day responsibility for any policing matters within the square mile that you're familiar with, the financial sector. And because of the very nature of that square mile, it being a business sector, frankly, the City of London Police has to be really good in three areas. CT, public events, because there's demonstrations almost every day in the city, and economic crime. Those three things they've got to get right. They've got to do really well. Other things are important, of course, but not quite on the same scale. So next slide, please. We'll just have a little look at some of the history of the city and CT attacks. So you see there between 1973 and 1993, there were 19 separate terrorist attacks in the City of London, in the square mile. Now that's in the context of, over that same period, something just short of 500 attacks across the UK mainland, mainly in London. I think sometimes, particularly for a generation who perhaps didn't live through that period in the 70s, it was quite phenomenal, the number of attacks that were taking place and the sort of fear, because they were covering a whole range of areas: shopping centres, iconic buildings, government buildings, etc., etc. In 1974 alone, 70 people were killed in the UK mainland. And as you can see there, that they were predominantly IRA. They had the traditional sort of warnings given in most attacks. Postal grenades, petrol bombs, incendiary devices were their main method of attack. The first attack on mainland Britain in the modern Troubles was at the Old Bailey in 1973, where a number of people were injured, 3 people were killed. And that was really the start of that terrorism campaign. You then move through that period with a number of other attacks, as I said, the 19, but the real big ones were in 92 and 93. Some of you will remember those. The first one in St Mary's Axe at the Baltic Exchange, 45 kilos of Semtex, which was the biggest bomb explosion on the British mainland since the Second World War. It caused, amongst the tragic 3 dead and 91 injured, it caused something like £800 million worth of damage in 1992 financial terms. They were estimated about 2 billion today. That was phenomenal. It was bigger than any of the attacks in Northern Ireland during the modern Troubles to that date. In the November of 92, after that attack, there was a van was stopped by police in the small hours of the morning in Stoke Newington. The driver ran off, was chased by police, and one of the police officers was shot, fortunately not killed. That had 3.2 tons of explosives in the back of it. It was on the morning of the Lord Mayor's show, and although it's never quite been proven, there was evidence that that van was seen in the vicinity of the city in the small hours before it was stopped in Stoke Newington. So the IRA were really focusing on the city. And then in 1993, you get the Bishopsgate bomb, where 1 dead, tragically a photographer, 40 injured, £350 million worth of damage. The city commissioner, my predecessor, was under huge pressure then. Businesses were effectively saying, quite rightly in many ways, look, sort this out or we're leaving. There's other options for us and we will leave the City of London. So there was a huge pressure on the city, and that's where you saw the first of these security zones implemented, Ring of Steel as it became known later. But it sort of developed over time. The number of points and ways that you can move in a vehicle through the city substantially reduced in that period. You can see 30 streets blocked. Those that were remained as entry points into the city had the little booths that still exist to this day that were manned 24/7 by police officers. Quite an unsophisticated tactic, but bluntly, it was what was needed to tackle that threat. Uniformed officers looking at and stopping vehicles entering the financial district of the city. Over the time that started also ANPR and CCTV, ANPR automatic number plate recognition, and it also developed a change in the response of business as well. And it's there that you see the start of some really sophisticated disaster recovery plans, private sector, private companies CCTV developed, and you got the first of Pool Re, the government-backed insurance cover for terrorist incidents. And arguably, it suggested that by 2001, when we had the attack in New York, that London and the financial district of London was far better prepared than perhaps elsewhere in the world. Next slide, please. So following those big bombs, big pre-planned warnings, etc., we then moved to a changing evolution of the threat. In the late 90s, the sort of peace process in Northern Ireland started to kick in. The IRA started to negotiate and agree that their attacks would be downgraded, although we know even today there are still radical elements in Northern Ireland that would want to continue the armed struggle, but it's nowhere near that scale of the 70s. But then you start to get a different type of threat, and some of it is linked with the sort of development of Islamic terrorism, but it's also a nature of our world online, etc. So you get in 2005, and you see the bus image there. No warnings to what was going to happen, no real intelligence beyond the sort of massive intel about lots of people talking about things. And that's one of the key challenges now. You can have lots and lots of talk, lots of conversation online. At what point do you realize that is moving to something more significant and an actual action? So 2005, no warnings to the bombs that disrupted London, including Aldgate in the city. In 2010, you had the stabbing of Stephen Timms, an MP. Notable, thankfully survived, but notable because the perpetrator had been radicalized online. And this is where we start to see the increasing power of social media. In 2013, Lee Rigby, the soldier, was killed in a very public display of aggression where the perpetrators consciously waited for the police to arrive. So you're getting this very different, high profile, almost like martyrdom, but wanting the front stage in publicity to actually perpetrate their cause. In Walthamstow, a lone actor attacked people in Walthamstow tube station, thankfully sort of disarmed. But again, you're starting to see the first signs of radicalism meets many people who are in some form of mental health crisis. And I think that's a real challenge for policing today. And you see that in some of the random attacks that are going on in the country at the moment. We then had 2017 Westminster and London Bridge in March and July of that year, and in 2019 Fishmongers Hall. And I think those were significant incidents, but I think, as I'm about to show you, that I think they could have been far, far worse had it not been for a lot of the work that policing and the city police had put in during the intervening time between the sort of the big traditional bombs and what you saw as radicalized people committing acts that often are very hard to predict. Next slide, please. So what were the evolution of tactics over that sort of 10 to 15 years? Well, the 4 Ps, I think, hopefully many of you in the audience are familiar with. It's the way that that policing and government are tackling the terrorist threats to prevent, pursue, prepare, and I think I said pursue twice, apologies, but hopefully you're all familiar with the 4 Ps, and that is about really making sure that we're using our intelligence to the best to direct resources where they're best needed, where we're trying to work upstream to prevent people getting involved in radicalization. I think at a time when the online radicalization can happen really quick, that's even more important than ever. But some of the other things we've listed there are things that were unique or started in the city. And I'll summarize very quickly. Project Griffin and Project Argus are about working with the security sector, working with businesses to better protect them against a terrorist threat. The ATRO, an anti-terrorist traffic regulation order, which allows police to implement closures and scenes really quickly without the usual process of having to go through road closures. The city were the first in the country to implement an ATRO in 2016 across the whole of the city area, not without challenge because of concerns about the ability of police to just close roads willy-nilly, but nonetheless something that was an important tactic to counter this evolving threat. Uplifting assets. In 2017, the attack in London Bridge that then went on to Borough Market, the terrorists were killed by City of London Police firearms officers. And if you look at the period between 2010 and 2017, the number of firearms officers in the city increased as it was me then and others in my senior team, recognised that actually our capability to respond to this evolving threat and the need for firearms officers was growing, and we needed to invest in that. With support from the corporation, that's what we did. The Ring of Steel I've talked about. There's been a huge program that is coming to a conclusion, I believe now, to upgrade that old technology of the Ring of Steel of the 90s into modern digital cameras and sensors, and to make it really match fit for the 21st century. And then Project Servitor is an initiative based on behavioural detection, which is focusing on looking for the people that are out of the norm. What triggers are there that would indicate that we need to talk further to somebody? And you'll see an image of a Project Servitor initiative on Tower Bridge. And that initiative has now grown and is rolled out across the whole country. Next slide, please. So partnership, I'll be really quick here because of time, but there is absolutely no doubt in my mind, having worked 13 years in the city, I had worked in the Met and in Surrey Police. The relationship between the police and businesses in the city was far, far more sophisticated, more profound, more developed in layers than anywhere I'd seen elsewhere. That's no criticism of the Met at all, and they have great partnerships as well. But the level and the intensity of that partnership in the city was, in my view, hugely impressive and world class. And you'll see there I've listed a number of the things that make this a very rich partnership that couldn't work. The CT effort of the City Police could not work without the partnerships. The Crime Prevention Association, CWSC is the cross-sector security communications started around the Olympics. That is all about the communication between businesses and the police. And frankly, any incident and any future instance, I can guarantee that one of the issues coming up in the feedback and the review will be communication. You cannot ever have enough communication, but the CWSC and other colleagues, the City Security Council, which also works to better improve the relationship, the sharing of intelligence, sharing of CCTV images between police and partners, is second to none. And that is borne out by the experience of those recent attacks. The Worshipful company I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail in a minute, but we also have the Security Institute, the Security Industry Association that regulates the sector, bridge calls on a regular basis between the main the main companies in the city and police on intelligence and update, trauma packs across the city to be used by security staff in the event of an incident. All of this work has a knock-on benefit to preventing crime and reducing crime in the city. Some of the statistics from Servitor will show that it actually has a knock-on effect to other crime, violent crime, drug dealing, all of those things are helping to reduce that, and the partnerships help that as well. And the industry is leaning in. The industry has become far more professional now. It has professional qualifications. It is trained. It is ready to support the police in any incident. Next slide, please. Of course, I couldn't finish without mentioning the company. The company started as a guild in 1999 and in 2004 became a company without livery. becoming the 108th livery company in 2008 and receiving the Royal Charter in 2010, thanks to some really dedicated, enthusiastic people who remain associated with the company today. And it has over 500 members at the moment. It's one of the larger liveries. And it works really closely with law enforcement to ensure that the industry of professionals, and it's really important that they're called security professionals because that's what they are, and they work closely with law enforcement, with policing, to make sure that the city is one of the safest places, not only in the UK, but in the world. And they do, they have a chartered security professionals qualification, and I'm delighted to be chair now of the regulatory authority that oversee the awarding of those quite challenging sort of accreditations, but which are really important in demonstrating competence. The Sheriff's Award for Bravery, recognising good work across the industry. They have an annual dinner with the commissioners of both the city and the Metropolitan Police separately. I was delighted to do that on a number of occasions. And again, just illustrates the great relationship between the company. They do the Whittington course, supporting young people to see the opportunities that the city offers for employment, not just in the security sector, but more widely as well. And that's a really good initiative as well. And the one I have failed to put on my slide, and I'll probably get chastised for neglecting, particularly as I've just become a trustee, is they have a charitable trust, as many liveries do, and that is a great initiative as well, dispensing money to people within the industry and initiatives within the industry. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and it just illustrates that the challenge of CT and the city remain. What we're seeing now is the growth of right-wing extremism, more challenging in many ways for policing than some of the sort of Islamic-inspired terrorism that we've seen recently, because the ideology and the doctrine is far more dispersed. What is right-wing extremism and what is just extreme political views? People like Tommy Robinson always just push the law to the limit about what is and isn't acceptable to say. But what the counter-terrorism resources in the UK are seeing is a growth in that right-wing activism, which requires them to be putting more and more resource into that. Attacks and threat continue. Since 2017, there have been 40 attacks in the UK prevented by the work of CT Command, CT Policing and the security services. That's a figure that is not widely known and can sort of lead, in my view, to a degree of complacency if we're not careful. The cyber element of terrorism is growing exponentially. At the moment, it is not believed that many of the terrorist groups have the capability to implement large-scale cyber attacks for terrorism purposes, but you then quickly get into what is the sort of level of state-sponsored terrorism from certain parts of the world. And I think that the whole online terrorism threat is one that is growing and requires more specialist resources within law enforcement. The role of the private sector is key here, and that's got to be the theme of my talk, really, which is you can have all of the resources, limited as they are in law enforcement, but that wider private sector capability, now a professional body, trained and willing to support at times of crisis. And that is really key. And you will hear, or you may hear in some of the sort of political posturing that will take place between now and the general election, and in some of the debate about the challenge the Metropolitan Police has at the moment. People will say, well, their national responsibilities, counter-terrorism needs to be put into a national unit. That has been a debate over time and has raised its head again. I personally am firmly against that. The reason I'm firmly against it is because you cannot, in my view, divorce successful counter-terrorism work from that community level way that policing operates, whether it be the community officers in some of our diverse communities that are able to gain intelligence from concerned families about radicalization, or whether it be in the city where you have a significant amount of the what we call Operation Lightning, which is sort of hostile reconnaissance surveillance report. A significant number of those are coming not from police officers but from the security sector, and that way that you operate at the tactical level. In my view, if you created a national body, you somehow will lose some of that connectivity to communities, and the city is a community, a very different one to anywhere else. I have rattled through it. I'd be delighted to answer any questions if I've left anything unanswered or if I haven't covered things that people wanted to. But Mark, over to you.
Ian, thank you. That was truly interesting. There are some questions coming in. We'll go to those, and I've got a mind full of my own questions as well. So we'll have lots to talk about. To pick one up that kind of came out in your last comments when you were talking about the rise of right-wing threats. Somebody says, I suggest that the left-wing growth already seen is far more worrying. Have you got some comments around that?
So look, I have to caveat my answer with saying that I'm slightly, in terms of my access to current intelligence, I'm probably a little bit behind the curve, because obviously I'm now a member of the public. But what I would say is I think the scale of the right-wing threat is what is concerning colleagues in counter-terrorism policing. The left-wing policing is apolitical, so it will look at it doesn't worry whether it's left or right-wing. It's looking at, is this a threat to institutions, to government, to the nation, to people's safety? And what I can say is that they would say that the majority of the real threat, the people this is not about protest. This is not about waving flags of whatever description in the street. This is about people plotting to kill prominent members of parliament. It's people plotting to create mayhem in the streets and cities. It's about people plotting actively to commit acts of violence. That's what it's about, and they would say the right wing is more prevalent in that space than the left wing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. A question that says, Ian, can you say anything about the levels of state-sponsored crime where states such as Iran and Russia are using local criminals to carry out their attacks on their critics?
Well, I think I would say, I mean, it's a good question, and again, I, like probably some people in the audience, was at a talk recently by Dominic Murphy, who is the commander in the anti-terrorist branch in the Met, and he was appropriately circumspect about the work they're doing on state-sponsored terrorism, and you understand that it's for government and politicians to be making statements about what other governments may or may not be doing. I think that what is clear is that there is one state, and Russia, without a doubt, is at the moment engaged in a long-term operation to eradicate opposition to the current regime. And you saw that in Salisbury as the prime example, but Livnenko before that. Are they using local criminals and organized gangs at the moment? No, it looks like their MO is to use operatives from FSB, their state intelligence, to travel. Now, given that travel for Russians is more restricted now, they are probably actively recruiting, but I would suggest more recruiting in those states that border Russia rather than coming to the UK to recruit people, although you have seen recently cases where people have been arrested and charged with terrorism offences. I don't think in the UK for supporting Russia, and there was a guard in the embassy in Berlin was charged recently with giving secrets to the Russians. I don't think it's at a scale that probably is to sort of, we're not into Reds under the bed scares or McCarthyism of the 1950s at the moment. I think it's something that at the moment probably the intelligence services and police have got to some degree under control. I use that word loosely.
Okay, thank you. Another question: is there a role for local authorities in this area?
Massive role for local authorities. Massive, I would say, and the corporation are very good in this space as well. So there's a huge role to play post-incident in leading the sort of return to normality. That has been for a while an important role. But I think in terms of that sort of work to prevent in the first case, I think local authorities have a responsibility with schools, and prevent campaign and prevent program in schools has been controversial. I think local authorities need to be leaders in this space and to perhaps better articulate than some have about why we need the prevent program. So I think education. I think in the physical environment, the sort of designing out the opportunity, and you saw in my presentation about how the corporation over time have significantly reduced the ability of people to move freely through the city by vehicles from a CT point of view. They, consideration has to be taken into account in planning. So I would say the role of local authorities is absolutely key, and the corporation, I will pay tribute to them. They're very good at that. They do, however, like all people who have responsibility for budget, you do have to make the case to them. It's not a given that they will just say, "Oh yes, Commissioner, yeah, we will agree to all this changes that you have to make." The ATRO is a good example, some significant challenge, but we made the case and they accepted that case, and then they were great supporters. So yeah, huge role for corporations and local authorities.
Okay. I'm going to blend a couple of questions in here on this one. So it says it'd be good to hear more about how hostile state threats are being recognised, and there's some questioning in there around cyber, online crime, the rise of AI, everything that is boundary less in a boundaried environment like the City of London.
So I think, yeah, I mean, it's almost it's a lecture in itself, really. I think the sort of growth of online and how the cyber security elements of physical security are blending as well. And many colleagues who are security professionals will know that, the sort of need for even entry systems that are based, have a sort of cyber element to them. I think my opening comment, or my first comment around this whole piece, is whether you're looking at counterterrorism or whether you're looking even at crime and fraud and cybercrime, I think in some cases it's really hard to discern the extent to which an organised crime group that is known to be operating across geographic boundaries, the extent to which they are state sponsored. I think the blurring between the two is very, very shady in some areas. So that is a challenge in itself, and you can see where some politicians have called out, for example, the Chinese for infiltrating and using data. The Chinese government are very robust in their response back that this is not to do with us. The whole debate around TikTok in the US is a good example of that. And I think that I would say that whole issue of how much you call out state-sponsored versus organised crime is probably at the moment still in the political space. It's for politicians to be determining that, because so much depends on it, doesn't it? Trade and business and diplomacy. I think the real threat online comes from organised crime groups. And I'm generalising hugely here, and colleagues may have a different view, but I think, as I said in the presentation, I think that it's sort of what we know as terrorist organisations probably don't have the capacity, the capability, the technical know-how at the moment to perpetrate significant online cybercrime, denial of service, that sort of thing. But I think the risk is that as technology develops, organised crime, who bluntly are pretty agnostic when it comes to reason, if they see an opportunity to make money, they'll make money. And I think the opportunities for cyber capability to be bought and sold online is growing. We know that malware, for example, is being bought and sold online on the dark web. And I think that is where the threat for terrorist groups, to be able to buy the capability that they don't have internally is kind of growing, really. So I think what I would say is that do not underestimate the capability of the National Cybersecurity Centre working with the intelligence services to be sort of pushing back at this and to be defending this country. I think they have a huge capability, and I think they're doing some really great work in this space. Most of it unknown to us, but I think it's really important work.
Okay. Again, I'm going to blur a couple of questions here on nearby localities and slightly further afield. So there's a question saying, I assume the city police don't cover Canary Wharf as main remit to Square Mile. Who covers Canary Wharf? That was a thought that came in my mind because I, like you, I lived through the Bishopsgate and St Mary Axe bombing, which was a catalyst to actually getting Canary Wharf off the ground, because no one was going out there because it was a million miles away, and suddenly it became the business continuity centre, and those that left, many didn't come back. So I think, I wonder about the interoperability of what goes on in Canary Wharf as almost a replica of what's happening in the city in a type of commerce that's going on. So not to put my own slant to it, but the question was about Canary Wharf. And if before you answer, there was another question that said, taking the success you had in London, what advice, how would you approach rolling out a similar approach within the West Midlands conurbation, which is the second biggest area outside of London? So you had a remit for the smallest, someone's looking about the second biggest. So if you could try and bring those two together a little bit, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Canary Wharf's interesting. If I wanted to be sort of mischievous with the Commissioner of the Met, either Cressida or Bernard Hogan-Howe, I used to always talk about how I was planning to take on responsibility for Canary Wharf. But the reality is that Canary Wharf is policed by the Metropolitan Police. It's part of their geographic area and will remain so. It's also got a significant private security footprint because obviously a lot of it is on private land. But what I would say is, because it's often asked, why doesn't the city take on Canary Wharf? Why, in some ways, sort of why would we? Because our geographic remit under our Act is the square mile, and the boundaries are very clearly defined. But here's the sort of reassurance to people, the Met and the city, forget the sort of canteen banter of the two different forces. They work really, really well together. And here's the evidence of that. Just prior to 2017, the attacks on Westminster Bridge and London Bridge, in 2016, the Mayor of London commissioned a report by Lord Toby Harris to look at the preparedness of London against a terrorist attack. And part of that remit was to look at the interoperability between City, Met and BTP. And the report, Lord Toby Harris was bluntly slightly mischievous and said, the Home Office should consider merging them, or merging City and London. I think there's a bit of history there about that. But then the attacks happened. And what came out of the inquest was that the interoperability between the three forces was in 99% of the time was perfect. Those areas where perhaps there could be improvement, and we're always looking to learn, the report said that they did not affect the ultimate outcome of that attack, and that actually there was lots of, quite rightly, praise to the emergency services and police for how they responded to that. And indeed, that attack, if you look at some of the elements of the police response, the firearms capability, the tactics that ensured that when the officers were there, they didn't know how many terrorists there were when they killed the three, had they killed all of them. A lot of that learning would show that those attacks had less impact than perhaps had there not been a lot of investment in training, etc. So I think that's the first one on the sort of interoperability. And then the second one, what lessons for West Midlands? Well, I think in a lot of what I've said, if you the beauty of the city is it small is beautiful. It enables you to test things very efficiently in a way that perhaps some of the bigger forces, and I have worked in them, so it's not a criticism, it's just the nature of their culture and how they operate. They just would find it too difficult to get a pilot going. So if you look at Griffin, if you look at Argus, if you look at Project Servitor, and indeed now if you look at recently some of the initiatives the city police have been doing around homeless and rough sleepers that are now being rolled out nationally. It's a great little sort of sort of test bed greenhouse of ideas. And I would say to colleagues in the West Midlands, a lot of what they're already doing has already been sort of implemented thanks to that sharing of knowledge. So Servitor is implemented. You've now got a very effective West Midlands counter-terrorist unit operating under the auspices of the Met Police, who have the priority for CT, but operating as a local resource. You've got the way that intelligence is shared between the security services and police has improved since the attacks of 2017, without a doubt. Maybe where I would say, and I speak from huge ignorance because I obviously don't work in the West Midlands, is I think if you were to look at those layers of sort of collaboration and cooperation between the police in the city and a professional, trained, accredited security industry, and the different elements that makes up, whether it be the trauma packs to assist in post-incident, whether it be the lightning reports that I mentioned, and the flow of information between police and the security sector. Because bluntly, one of the criticisms of police over time has always been, you take loads of intel from us, you never share it back. And I think what the city has done is done some great work around making sure that intelligence flow is two-way rather than one-way. So it's some of those, plus the things like Griffin, which is now ACT, the national initiative, and Argus. These are all things that I think you could sort of look at a little bit of a checklist and say, are we implementing them? I would suggest you probably are 85% of them. Maybe just look at that sort of partnership and relationship with the security sector, with the security industry.
Thank you, Ian. It's probably maybe the last question, and you and I will be in trouble if I don't ask it because it's from your master, Russell Penny. So, we
Right.
doff our cap to the master. He's just saying, would you please reference the significance of Martin's Law?
Interesting. So, yes, I will, definitely. So, Martin's Law, for those of you who maybe not familiar with it, is legislation which has, at the moment, looks like it's been a casualty of the Prime Minister calling an election, but is a product of the sort of aftermath of the Manchester Arena bomb, where amongst a number of lessons was the fact that, question was that venue properly prepared for something like the event that happened. And it's sort of been driven by the mother of Martin Heck, one of the casualties, one of the young people who sadly died, and she's done a tremendous job, Fegan, of promoting Martin's Law. What Martin's Law would do, and I'm probably a bit rusty on some of the detail, but in effect, it's placing a statutory obligation on venue owners to have systemic plans for and to have a conscious duty to protect people in their venues. So I think it would be a game changer in terms of making sure people take their responsibilities seriously, because in that tragic incident, clearly there were questions not just about the venue but about law enforcement as well. And I think Martin's Law just gives strength to it. It's like any legislation. If you legislate, is it going to change the world overnight? No, it's not. But it makes people, it drives the behaviours that you want. So really important. And Fegan marched recently from London to Manchester to meet with the Prime Minister about it. He met with her and sort of said, oh yeah, very important, blah, 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 and then went and called an election and no legislation going through. So quite frustrating, but I'm hopeful that a new government will put this on the agenda for an early legislative act.
Okay, thank you. Time really has run against us. I feel awful because there are lots of questions I didn't get to ask, but as I said at the start, we will share all of the questions with you, Ian, and it's in your gift if you'd like to respond to the people directly. So just some quick call outs for some upcoming webinars in the series. I'll leave you to look at those while I just say some final thank yous. Obviously, a very special thank you to Ian for giving up the time this morning for, quite frankly, a fascinating and interesting lecture. Always thank you to our Lord Mayor for putting this whole series together. It really is a marvellous asset of the year, and it's just super interesting to hear everything and the whole breadth of it. Always thank you to Zed Yen, and sitting behind the scenes is a man called Jacopo who did all the button pushing, slide doing today. So thank you, Jacopo, again for what you do for this. Most important of all, of course, thank you to the audience. You've had a very attentive and very inquisitive audience. And as I say, apologies again, I didn't get to ask all the questions, but thank you everybody for giving up this time on your Friday to come in, and really just to wish you all a very, very happy weekend, and looking outside, hopefully a dry one. So thank you and goodbye. Thank you, Ian.